today's interview, we are joined by Mr. Victor Peng. Victor is the president of AMD, leading their adaptive and embedded computing group. Victor started his career as a consulting engineer at DEC, before moving to Silicon Graphics and eventually to MIPS Technologies, where he started as an engineer and then transitioned to vice president of engineering. His transition from an engineer continued when he began at Xilinx, where he served as an executive vice president of products, then the chief operating officer, and eventually as president and CEO starting in 2018. The prevalence of Victor's roles today as a distinguished engineer and executive are what we will discuss in today's interview. Victor, it's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So let's get right into it. Let's start from the beginning of your career. You had engineering titles at DEC, Silicon Graphics, and MIPS Technologies. What was your career like as an engineer? And were there natural signs of progression towards your role as an executive later on?
Yeah, I think it's in some respects, it was a fairly typical progression, although it wasn't completely linear. What I mean by that is, I started as an individual contributor doing silicon design. Then I became a project leader and started managing groups. I got to a point in management where it was a fairly large team, but at one point I decided, you know what, I kind of want to get back into getting my hands dirty directly.
Okay.
So I went back to doing, direct design work. And after that, I kind of realized that, you know what, I still like the management side of things. So I got back onto sort of a management track. And again, progressing through different levels within all of the engineering, then as you captured, eventually into some more business focused roles.
Interesting. And then your first executive position was in MIPS Technologies as a VP of engineering. You said you chose that role more directly?
Yeah, I mean, again, I started out MIPS as an engineering director. And by the way, this is MIPS after it became an IP company, not the original MIPS computer systems. And then I had the opportunity to become vice president of engineering. And while it was a relatively smaller size business, it was a public company, so I was a Section 16 officer. And that was very helpful in terms of, eventually when I became a more senior executive at Xilinx. Because you still had to deal with the board of directors, investor relations, contracts, and all kinds of things that you didn't necessarily get as an experience just doing engineering work.
And speaking of that executive position at Xilinx, were there any defining moments that led you up to that point in your career, or you can look back and perhaps share some insights on how you got there and important moments to share with us by any chance?
Yes, and again, we already kind of covered some of the experiences at MIPS. While it was a small company, since I was, reporting to the CEO and doing a lot of the work at that level. When I joined Xilinx, I also reported to the CEO, first running a lot of engineering, both the silicon software and boards and other IP. But then I was responsible for the product definition. So I had product planning, product marketing, and ultimately, like you said, in the CEO, so I learned sales and things. I would say, in each of my roles in each of those companies, I picked up different things that helped me prepare for being a CEO, which is a tremendously broad role,
right.
Tremendously challenging, but also incredibly rewarding.
And would you say that those learnings that you found throughout, would you seek them, or were they kind of naturally bestowed upon you in a way?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess what I would say, people have different career trajectories. Some people are, very clear in what they want to do and they actually follow through. Other people, do different things. And what I would say is, in one sense, mine now is kind of boring. I went to an engineering school, became an engineer. I had many roles within different areas of engineering. But I guess I would say is that after a while, it became more of how can I really help the company, and have a greater impact? How can I help broader teams? Because I really both love technology, I still love products, but I think working with teams and of diverse nature, working with customers, partners, it just led me to the point where, at some point I did say to myself, if I had the opportunity to become a CEO, I would. So it wasn't one of these things where, from a very young age, I aspired to be a CEO. It was really through those experiences and continuing want to help people more, have a greater impact, and also continue to learn and develop.
But on the other side of things, when you got promoted to CEO of Xilinx, was there perhaps a side of the engineer in you that you had to leave behind, quote unquote? And is there aspects of a job as an engineer that you perhaps missed?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, what I would say is long before I became CEO, in some of these senior management roles, you're not really doing, let's face it, you're not really doing detailed engineering. But in other respects, what I learned, as a young engineer and through even the middle part of my career never really left me, right? And that's analytical skills, right? How to approach a problem, how to solve a problem, um, managing complex programs, working in teams of diverse nature, geographically dispersed around the world. A lot of those skills that even when I was doing engineering work and moving into engineering leadership, that certainly helps propel me, and I use those analytical skills, problem solving, teamwork skills. Certainly as a CEO, and even before that from a business perspective. So yes, in respects you do leave things behind, but in other respects the fundamental skills and the experience you have, you utilize over and over. And it's really, in that sense, it's really rewarding, right? Because the job is not the same, but you get to keep building on the things that you've literally taken decades to acquire. So.
And the tools to become a CEO, the analytical skills you mentioned, among other things, would you say that working in Silicon Valley particularly helped you to acquire those at an accelerated rate by any chance?
Yeah, I started my career actually in the Northeast. DEC was based in Massachusetts, and certainly had a great grounding in, I guess I would say, the craft of engineering at that point in time. I had limited experience with customers and more on the business side at that point. When I came to Silicon Valley, and I worked at a number of places before even getting to MIPS. Actually, to say, in addition to MIPS, I worked at a number of places, including a startup. So yes, coming to Silicon Valley did, I would say, fill out a lot of breadth. As I mentioned, as many people in Silicon Valley do, try a startup. And I was a VP of engineering of a very small group. And I got a flavor from that because previous to that, I mainly worked at larger companies, public companies and things of that nature. So yes, absolutely, the Valley's a pretty special place, but I wouldn't say that, I think there's opportunities wherever you are to, get that kind of breadth. But certainly the Valley, of the density of all the different things, the combination of business and customers and finance and technology, of course, university research and everything is quite rich in one area.
But then looking back even before your career really started, when you said electrical engineering at Cornell, can you connect any of your learnings from your studies directly to your executive positions at Xilinx and AMD? And is there knowledge or are there characteristics that you've carried throughout that you can identify?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, of course you're learning, the engineering, the science and math skills and things like that. But as I said, there's certain analytical skills and, I would almost say learning how to learn, because that is one thing in all your career, no matter what, whether you get to be a CEO, whatever it is, throughout your career, you're going to be learning. And one of the things about university is it gives you the tools to approach learning. Mm-hmm. I would also say more pragmatically in that area is I was also had the good opportunity to also be a co-op student, both in my undergrad at Rensselaer, but also when I was at Cornell, and that really gave me a much more practical grounding of exactly what the profession of engineering looked like. I was a co-op at IBM in different locations. So, yeah.
So would you say that it's foolish to try and set yourself up for an executive level position at the highest level right out of or even during your university studies? Is there anything students that are currently studying can do to prepare themselves for that level of success?
Well, I guess the way I would say is it's only foolish if you haven't done some really important thinking, right? And first, when you say you aspire to be a very senior executive, do you know what that really means, and what do you mean by that, right? That could be anything from an entrepreneur and a more founder in a startup environment, or it could just be running your own small business, or it can be a senior executive at a public company, right? So one is have you really been thoughtful and understand what it is you think you're aspiring to? The other piece, I think, is being thoughtful from more of an introspective perspective, which is like being brutally honest with yourself about what is your skill set, what are your abilities. But also, at least as important, what is your motivation, right? Like, why do you want to do that? Is it because you perceive there's, all these, whatever, fame or power or whatever it is? I think you really need to be thoughtful about those things. And again, a tremendous amount of honesty, because these very senior positions are very difficult. They're very challenging. They're hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. And if you haven't done that good thinking, you won't be successful if you ever even reach that position. But if you've done that thinking, then I wouldn't say it's foolish, right? So it's really a matter of how much thought have you put into it, and how honest are you, and how deep do you dig in those self kind of explorations.
I think the point about motivation is particularly interesting. On that note, for a current university student like myself, it's hard to fathom the qualities and features of an executive, of a CEO or president of a company such as large as AMD. What values and opportunities as the president of AMD do you value the most? And perhaps a personal anecdote you have on that note.
Yeah, gosh, I mean, first of all, I guess what I would say is, one of the great things about being in a position of this is that you have the ability to, well, I guess the way I would look at it is, my view of senior leadership is sort of the stewardship model, right? Like, you are helping a team be the best that they can be and to create tremendous value, right? And I also love products and technology, right? But, you can create values in lots of different ways and lots of different models. And so I really love the fact that we're doing innovative, high performance, really complex products that really help our customers, in turn be very successful and have an impact and, really touch and improve people's lives, right? And AMD is a very large company, fast growing, doing the cutting edge technology. And so that speed and that scale means that, myself and my team have the ability to touch more people's lives more quickly. Right? So I think that's a tremendous opportunity, tremendously rewarding. It's also incredibly challenging, right? But through that process, you also grow a lot, right? In terms of an anecdote, I mean, what I would say is that we've been one company. We closed the acquisition approximately 6 months ago. We already did a lot of things together, but I would say even just this journey to bring two really good companies, great companies together, Xilinx and AMD, and that's a very challenging thing. We were chatting a little bit earlier, but the opportunities we now have as one company is just amazing, right? And I'm just really incredibly excited. So I don't have an anecdote right now, but stay tuned because you are going to hear some amazing things from the AMD.
Okay. And with this merger, how do you see your role developing in the future? What is the next step for you?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, to be honest, and this is one thing I will say that for me, I've kind of done most of my career, which is I mainly focus on doing what I'm doing really, really well, right? And look, I've been in the industry like 40 years now, so to some extent, I'm probably a little bit less worried about my next thing than I used to be. And even then, I didn't, focus on that as much as, as I said, I worry a lot about, am I doing the best that I can in my current role? Because the reality is, even if you're doing a pretty good job, there's always room to do better. Excellence is a process, not a destination. And I think if you do that well, that leads you to something interesting next, right? And certainly for myself, having been a CEO for some period of time, now having the great opportunity and honor to be the president of AMD, I'm super excited about what I'm doing already, so I don't have to really focus about what could be the next thing.
I love that. I love that. Finally, what message do you have for young business students, young engineers that perhaps look up to you and your career? What advice do you have for them?
Well, what I would say is, this gives you maybe a little flavor for my journey. It's different for everybody. As you said, like I didn't, when I was young, didn't say I would aspire to be a CEO one day. In fact, I would say even fairly well into my career, I wouldn't say that was my goal or think that that would be what I would be able to do. So for me, it was very, very easy to do this. Let me focus on doing this well. And once I think I'm doing that well, is there a way for me to grow and impact things more? And that ultimately led me to that place. For others, it is fine. Like I said, if you've really been thoughtful, if you've really been honest with yourself, and you're like in school and you say, you know what, I do want to be an entrepreneur and run my own company, or I do want to work at a very big scale at company in a public enterprise, that's fine, so long as you've done that work. So I think some of the key things would be, be thoughtful, be very honest, seek the truth, learn continuously. The other thing too is, for me, I do believe in this stewardship thing too. So it's not all about you. In fact, when you go into leadership, it's really about your teams and other people. So I think if you put that thought not even just about yourself, but in the context of teams and the greater community, I think those are good things too. And your exact path will depend on what you conclude after you do that thought process.
And lastly, a WHU Inside Business Classic question. Is there a book that you can recommend to our viewers that aligns with the knowledge that you've shared with us today?
Yeah, I can't tell you that there's one book.
Okay, so many.
Yeah, there's so many. And look, let's face it too, it's like there's not really a book that tells you how to navigate something as complex as becoming a CEO. And it's also because, every individual is different, right? So that's why I sort of said, everyone's journey is a little bit different. Mine's one, but it doesn't mean that that's the right one to follow. I'd say there are several books, and this isn't even, comprehensive. One that I think was a very good book is this whole, the book by Daniel Kahneman, right? Thinking Fast and Slow. More recently, I think he and others came up with a book called Noise. I think that's kind of interesting. On the other end of the spectrum, Adam Grant puts out some good books. I think Give and Take and other books. So again, maybe that's another thing is should read broadly. And you notice I didn't mention none of those books are engineering books. Of course, Hennessy and Patterson, Computer Architecture. That's an awesome book. But I really think no matter if you really want to be broad in some sense in leadership, whether the CEO, but just some senior leadership, you really do need breadth. You want great depth in some discipline that's really important, and partly because, again, it gives you the craft of doing analysis and how to solve problems and things. But you want a lot of breadth because, ultimately, if you rise to certain levels of impact, you're going to be dealing with many different people from many different functions and disciplines and indeed really cultures, and I mean truly cultures right around the world, because I ran teams that were all over the world. So that breadth is really important. The other thing I always feel is that many very interesting things and many opportunities happens at boundaries of things, right? So boundaries of disciplines, boundaries of cultures, right? So I think there's if you have that breadth and you could actually understand across these boundaries, or how that's the whole essence of biomedical engineering, for instance, and other kinds of multidisciplinary things, is being able to have some understanding across two different disciplines and seeing some opportunities that maybe people who are only expert in one may not see, right? So I think that may be another thing that I would suggest, and that's why I say it's kind of hard to pinpoint one book, because you really have to read broadly.
Well, Victor, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for sharing your insights with us.
It was a pleasure.
To our viewers, thank you for tuning into this episode, and we will see you next time.